Hi, my name is Isabel Castelao Gomez, and I'm a member of the course team for Comentario de Textos Literarios en Lengua Inglesa. I welcome you to this video class, Elements of Poetry 1, where we will learn to identify visual elements of a poem, the visual elements of a poem. There will be 3 sections in this class. The first one will focus on the differences between prose and poetry and how poetry contains visual and oral poetic elements. The second section, visual elements of poetry related to form, will detain on the elements that address the reader's physical eye. The third section, visual elements of poetry created by figurative language, will detain on those elements that address the reader's mental eye and create mental pictures in the reader of the poem. We will see poetic techniques by figurative language such as simile, metaphor, metonymy, and synecdoche. Okay, what makes poetry different from prose? In general terms, prose focuses on the telling of an event or a story. Poetry could also tell a story, but meaning is highlighted through visual and oral aspects of language. Poetic language is not somehow transparent. Its texture is created by visual and sound effects addressed at the reader's eye and at the reader's ear. Elements of Poetry 1 is a brief introduction to the basic visual aspects of poetic language. We will see poetic techniques that call attention of the reader's physical eye through the form of language or the form of words. We will talk about poetic techniques that call the attention of the reader's mental eye through figurative language. Elements of Poetry 2, a following video class, on the other hand, will introduce the oral aspects and sound effects that we can find in a poem. Okay, we will see in this section the visual elements of poetry related to the form of language. To understand the general visual effects on the page of a poem, we should imagine language as paint and the page as canvas. Poetry has a specific vertical structure, whereas most prose or narrative texts run horizontally along the page. This chosen line ending technique makes poetry unique and different from prose. The author or poet chooses a specific word and not other to finish each particular line. The main poetic element to create visual structure on the page is the stanza. A definition of a stanza will be a section of a poem made by a group of lines sharing a pattern called stanzaic form. We can have couplets, which is a stanzaic form formed by 2 lines, quatrains, stanzaic forms formed by 4 lines, or free verse, which does not follow a specific or fixed stanzaic form. Apart from stanzas, there are other elements poets use and experiment with to create visual structures on the page. For example, we have lines. They could be used as a fixed set of lines, such as the sonnet, which contains 14 lines, or the poet could have an experimental use of lines on the page. Another element to create a visual structure on the page in a poem would be font, the font of the letter. For example, in this fragment by Minoloi, we can see how the poet uses capital letters inside the poem to create a visual effect. Another element will be punctuation, and in this case I chose the characteristic example of the uses of dashes by Emily Dickinson. Another type of a structural poetic form will be shaped poems. Shaped poems are shaped on the shape of a certain object or thing. In this case, Lewis Carroll's The Mouse's Tale poem. It's an example of a shaped poem here. Fine. Next section, visual elements of poetry made by figurative language. We'll talk about images and imagery. That is, the visual poetic elements that create images in the reader's mind through figurative language. To understand this, we have to differentiate and identify literal versus figurative language. The literal language will refer to the real object or the normal meaning of the word, the real object behind the word. Figurative language refers to an imaginary meaning beyond the real meaning of the word. Okay, let's talk about poetic techniques related to figurative language that create images through likeness or similitude. We will talk about two figures here, simile and metaphor. As an example of simile, we will use the line, "My lover's eyes are like the sun." In this line, the likeness between eyes and sun is made explicit by the word like. And this is what makes this line, this figure or image, a simile. In the next line, "My lover's sands shine on me," we have a metaphor. Why? Because one term in the comparison between eyes and the sun is hidden, that is, the part of eyes. Let's detain here on the elements of the metaphor. Working again with the same line, "My lover's sands shine on me." Okay? In this line, the tenor of the metaphor sands, the tenor will be eyes. The vehicle would, the tenor will be eyes. That is the object or element from reality we are referring to. The vehicle of the metaphor would be sands or sun. That is the imaginative or figurative object or element it is similar to. And the ground of the metaphor would be light or radiance. The ground is the characteristic or quality we are highlighting in the comparison made in the metaphor. Let's practice these elements with two more lines. For example, the day and night of life. Day and night are metaphors. The tenor in this metaphor would be youth and old age. The vehicle would be day, night, and the ground will be the beginning and end of a cycle, or light and darkness. In the next line, a rose in the people's garden, we have the metaphor rose, in which the tenor would be woman, the vehicle would be the flower, and the ground will be beauty. Okay, another poetic technique using figurative language is the creation of images through association. We will consider two figures here, which are generally considered types of metaphor. Okay, metonymy and synecdoche. Let's see three lines for metonymy. We have from the cradle to the grave, the crown spoke her mind, and he boiled the kettle. Okay, in the first line, from the cradle to the grave, the cradle and grave are metonymies because they associate to the tenor, birth and death through proximity. Okay? When we are born, we lie in a cradle. When we die, we lie in the grave. The crown spoke her mind. In this case, the crown will be a metonymy because it relates to the tenor, queen, by proximity to. Okay? In the next one, he boiled the kettle. The kettle would be a metonymy because it relates to the other term in the comparison, water, by proximity too. We are not boiling the kettle, literal language, we are boiling the water inside the kettle. The next figure, synecdoche, associates the terms in the creation of the image through the relation of part and whole. We have the line here, many hands will be needed, or 4 mouths to feed, okay? In this case, hands represents people, and mouths represents people by being a part of the whole of the body that the hands and mouth belong to, okay? Synecdoches are very frequently represented by, we will find many synecdoches in the form of parts of the body for this reason. Okay. Other poetic techniques that create images in the reader's mind using figurative language, for example, are personification or prosopopoeia. Let's see these 2 lines. Trees whispered secrets, misery prepares breakfast. In this case, trees and misery are personifications because they are inanimate objects or abstract concepts that are personified. Another figure, symbols. In this case, I chose the examples of owl and fish, who represent wisdom and cries. The characteristic of the symbol is that the relation between the tenor and vehicle in the symbol is not arbitrarily or chosen by the author poet, but it's established, it's culturally established by the society it belongs to. All right. As a way of conclusion and summary, we can say that we have seen in this video class, Elements of Poetry 1, what makes poetry different from prose through its visual elements. And in order to channel all this that we have seen here in this video class in relation to poetry analysis or text analysis, we can say that when you analyze a poem or fragment of a poem, remember that poetic language has a specific visual and sound effects that address the reader's eye and the reader's ear. Identify the visual elements in the poem. First, the form of the poem and language. Pay attention to its vertical structure, the chosen line ending by the author, the lines on the page, etc. Also, I forgot to include here the main element in this case in the form of the poem, the stanza and the stanzaic form. And the most important thing will be this question: how do they contribute, how these visual elements in relation to the form of the poem contribute to the meaning of the poem? Then, secondly, focus on or identify the figurative language that create images in the poem. For example, the poetic techniques that create mental pictures in the reader. Find metaphors, analyze their parts, tenor, vehicle, round, similes, metonymies, or personifications. The most important questions you can ask yourselves is, why did the author choose these images or metaphors? How do they contribute to the meaning of the poem? Remember to ask yourself these questions for a good analysis of a poem or a fragment or a poetic fragment. What techniques does the author use to highlight the visual effects of the poem? Are the images and visual elements of the poetic language in the fragment important for the meaning of the whole poem? Well, Elements of Poetry 1 has been a brief introduction to the most basic visual elements of the poem, so you can identify them in your text analysis. Remember that our next video class, Elements of Poetry 2, will focus on the oral sound elements, addressing the reader's ear in poetry, another crucial feature of poetic language. Thank you very much.